Thank you for tuning in to this iGrow podcast. My name is Warren Rusche. I am one of the SDSU Extension Cow-Calf Field Specialists, and we're going to talk today about heat stress in cattle and how we as producers can deal with and manage and mitigate some of those risks that we face. First thing we want to keep in mind is that cattle respond differently and are more sensitive to heat stress and do not handle heat as well as humans do, especially cattle that are in confinement. So in situations where we as individuals might not think it's all that warm or all that hot, our cattle may be already under some significant kind of stress. And because of that, it's very important for us to start early as soon as there's some excessive heat in the forecast so that we have made some plans and have started to take some steps to make the conditions more comfortable and less stressful for our cattle. One thing to keep in mind and to watch our cattle for is some of the symptoms and signs of stress. As their bodies respond to the stress that they are under, they will show some of these symptoms and allow us some indication that they are in some kind of suffering, some kind of stress levels, that we need to take some steps to address that. Some of those symptoms include labored and faster breathing. That's one of the key ways that an animal will relieve heat load from their body is increase their respiration rate. They'll also be slobbering from the mouth, and cattle will tend to bunch up in groups in order to, as a herd, try to alleviate some of that heat load. One of probably the critical factor for us to do as managers is to make sure that our cattle have sufficient water available. As the temperatures go over 80 degrees, we may need to provide up to 2 gallons or more per every 100 pounds of body weight. So for instance, a 1,200-pound steer in a feedlot might be consuming 24 gallons of water, and we need to make sure that we have enough not only delivery capacity, but we may also need to provide some extra tank space. Some of the research is suggesting that up to 3 inches per every head, that we need up to 3 inches of tank space for every head that we have so that they have enough access so that those cattle can get the water they need when they need that. One of the other very critical factors to mitigate and reduce some of that risk from heat stress and losses is to avoid handling cattle if at all possible. Ideally, we would say don't handle them at all under some significant heat stress so that we aren't raising the body temperatures unnecessarily. However, in some cases, that handling does have to occur, and therefore we want to do those in the early morning hours if possible, ideally before 8 in the morning and certainly before 10 o'clock in the morning. Also then we want to allow at least 6 hours of cooling past that peak temperature before we start any processing work, so that we give those animals some time to let that heat load escape from their body before we add some additional stress that would tend to raise their body temperature. Sprinklers and providing and wetting the cattle is another tool that can be used to alleviate heat stress. One of the keys is that we need to use large droplets of water and not a system that would create a mist. And the reason for that is that those mists tend to increase the relative humidity around that animal and actually make that problem worse. So if we use the large droplets and soak the animal and then turn the sprinklers off for a time to allow that water to evaporate, that's going to speed up and help that cooling process and lower the temperature of that animal's body. Wetting the ground that the animals are on is also very effective, as it will cool the ground, lessen the amount of radiant heat that those animals are being exposed to. An additional step that I don't have listed on the slide would be in some cases adding some light colored bedding is proven to be successful, as that light color doesn't absorb the radiant heat from the sun and it in effect creates a cooler ground temperature for those cattle. It's also important then to keep in mind that if we do use sprinklers, not only do we need to make sure we have enough capacity in our watering system to handle the water intake that those cattle have, but also the amount of water that our sprinkling setup will require. So in some cases, we may need to be talking to local fire departments or co-ops with water tanker equipment so that we can have enough capacity to deliver the amount of water that we need to those animals. One other management practice that's successful and effective in managing heat stress is how we handle our feed management. We would want to shift our feeding schedule to evenings after the peak temperatures. Ideally, we want to shift that to feeding schedule to 70% of their daily feed or more to that evening feed schedule. And what that is doing is that the heat increment, or the amount of extra heat that comes from digestion and metabolism, that would occur during the coolest part of the day rather than during the heat of the day. And it also serves, by shifting feed, that also serves to keep those cattle on feed and lessen the amount of acidosis that they might have. In feedlot heifers, we would like to feed MGA, which will prevent those cattle from showing estrus and cycling activity, as a way to reduce the amount of activity those cattle their activity level during the course of the day. Obviously, that does not apply if an individual is marketing cattle into one of the natural or non-hormone treated programs, but if that fits your situation and you are finishing heifers, adding MGA would be a very effective method of handling and managing heat stress. Some additional steps that are available that may be feasible, may not be something that can be done quickly, but it might be something that could be done thinking down the road, would be things such as increasing airflow, identifying windbreaks that perhaps aren't needed, and if they aren't, then if those windbreaks weren't there, that would increase the amount of airflow that those cattle have. Putting up shade facilities has been a very effective tool to help alleviate heat stress. And if we are going to take some of these additional steps, we may want to target the highest risk cattle first. And those would be the cattle with a greater live weight, and in particular those heavy cattle that are also black-hided. Those are the cattle, the population that's the most sensitive to heat, at the highest risk of loss. So if we were going to start making some changes to pens, we might want to target those cattle first before perhaps doing the entire yard. Lastly, when we're thinking about heat stress, we don't want to forget about the people that are involved in the operation. We want to minimize the amount of strenuous work we're doing during peak temperatures and take breaks when necessary so we aren't getting into a heat stroke or heat exhaustion condition. We need to think about forcing water consumption. Even if you don't necessarily feel thirsty, we want to increase that water intake to help eliminate or reduce our risk of heat stress and heat exhaustion. And also, if ideally we have a buddy system, so if we're having two people working together that can each monitor themselves to see if there's any signs of heat exhaustion and then take some steps to address that. I'd like to thank you for watching this podcast, this iGrow podcast. If you have any other further questions, please contact one of the state livestock extension specialists or one of the livestock field specialists across South Dakota. We would be more than happy to help you answer any questions and help you solve some of these problems you might be dealing with heat stress as related to cattle operations. Thank you.